Welcome to the Business End of Agility podcast, hosted by New Zealand's Business Agility Meetup community. We're here to bring you real-world stories from innovative organisations and forward-thinking leaders around the globe. We're going to explore all facets of business agility, from adaptive leadership and evolving company cultures to emerging ways of working, processes and technologies. I'm your host for the session, Bianca, and thank you for joining us. Welcome everyone. This episode is Unlocking the Z Factor in Your Organizations. We're going to explore the impacts of new generations becoming the majority in our workforce and the impacts of multi-generations at work. We'll look at how this changes the needs of our employees and what that means for organizational culture, leadership, and employee engagement. And to help us today, I have the amazing Luke Goetting. He is a dynamic future of work expert and speaker. So you might have heard him on TEDx already. He'll be sharing his deep insights into the aspirations and work styles of these particular generations. And helpfully, Luke has already helped numerous organizations future-proof their workforce and foster a culture of innovation by actually implementing what is effective strategies for engaging and retaining Gen Z and their talent. So important because they're going to become a majority of the workforce sooner than you think. So that's what today's conversation is about. And welcome, Luke, to the podcast today.
Thank you so much, Bianca. I'm thrilled to be beaming across the world to our listeners everywhere, and such an important conversation. So the privilege to be able to speak to it and hopefully help facilitate intergenerational collaboration around the world.
Fantastic. And now, Luke, you are obviously traveling a lot with your talks and so forth. Whereabouts in the world are you today?
I am in Austin, Texas. But yes, it's been in the U.S. especially, the fall tends to be a popular conference season. So in September, I was at 9 or 10 different events. It's been pretty similar in October. It's definitely been a Where's Waldo kind of traveling the country and a little bit of the world. I'm actually headed up to Canada in a week or two, and it was in Australia back in August.
Oh, fabulous. Our near neighbours. Whereabouts in Australia were you?
Melbourne.
Lovely.
That was actually an agile conference there.
That was really nice. Agile Australia, wasn't it?
Yep, exactly.
Well, I'm hoping you can share some of your insights from around the world today as we talk about the generations. I, of course, have the most important question, which came to me as I was thinking about the different names of the generations. So, when you have tornadoes, somebody goes through a process of naming different weather systems. Who goes through the process of naming the generations?
Yeah, that one is fascinating, and I didn't know it initially, and I'll just say out front, as far as I'm aware, there is no generational meeting committee in the United Nations or something along those lines. So I think it kind of emerges somewhat organically, just with various journalists and sociologists and different people who cover these types of conversations. So that's why sometimes you'll find different ranges for which generations are, what years, because it's not some scientific method as much as I think people start to see one that starts to gain some traction, and that generally becomes the accepted practice. That's as far as I know. But we'll keep hunting. Maybe there is some secret committee somewhere we need to look into further.
Yeah, some sort of handshake. I feel like that Gen X, which is, of course, I'm biased because I'm Gen X, has the coolest name. But obviously there's a few different names as we go through. Perhaps a good start would be, could you give us a rundown of the different generations and what might be the differences between them, just so we have kind of a point of reference for today?
Of course. So the four primary ones in the workforce right now, I'll start with the most senior. It's going to be the baby boomer generation, then Gen X, then millennials, and now Gen Z. those tend to be that comprises probably over 95% of the workforce right now. The silent generation is the generation that preceded the baby boomers, and there are still a couple of percentage points of silent generation still in the workforce. And then the next generation coming up after is Generation Alpha. So it kind of reset going from Gen Z or Z to Gen Alpha. So real quickly, so Gen Z was the generation born between 1997 and 2010, meaning, and I feel like a lot of people are sort of surprised by this, but as we look toward 2025, the oldest of Gen Z will already be turning 28 years old.
Wow.
So yeah, they're not just the baby interns. They are increasingly becoming a big percentage of the workforce. In fact, they'll be over 25% by next year. And then millennials, which is the generation born between 1980 and 1997, meaning, I'll do some off the top of my head math. Well, that means the oldest millennials are starting to turn like 45 years old.
Wow.
So again, sometimes I feel like millennial, even today, is used a little bit synonymously with, young professionals.
Just young people. Yes.
Yeah, but again, the more senior millennials, they're well into their 40s.
Amazing. Interesting. Generation Alpha is the next one. I wonder if the naming conventions will start to solidify to Generation Bravo, Generation Charlie, and so forth thereafter.
It seems to go that way. Millennials are also known as Gen Y, but I feel like everyone just uses it. So it is technically X, Y, Z, but millennials became the more popular cultural term.
Right. And in terms of how they differ, in terms of kind of the differences between the generations, because you're right, people do tend to group, kind of like, oh, well, everyone's a young person, so therefore they're all millennials, and that's kind of the phrase that we use, and they all act the same. But that's not quite the case, is it?
No, and of course, it's always ambitious to tackle these hundreds of millions of people, billions of people, and give broad strokes conversation. So inevitably, Bianca, I have to give a quick disclaimer on that front there.
And fair enough.
My area of expertise really leans in on Gen Z and millennials in that they are the first really digital native generation. And many of the generational characterizations tend to come from pretty significant events that happen culturally or historically. For example, the baby boomer generation, which emerged after World War II. And so digital natives, the more I have spoken and hosted my podcast, Gen Z at Work, and worked with organizations who are looking to drive better engagement with Gen Z, the more I have found that underlying familiarity with technology, Gen Z being the first generation that really had the internet available from the first moments they could steal their parents' iPads. As a millennial, and I'm kind of a mid-range millennial myself, I do remember a time where I had to get out our family had like the Encarta CD-ROMs that had the encyclopedias loaded on them. So I do remember a time where that was, you kind of hope and pray that whatever you searched would have an entry affiliated with it, because if not, that it was just it. It was just all or nothing. And so Gen Z Gen Z never really had that, having access to the internet. And so a couple quick hitting, obviously we'll dive deeper, but to me where things really differentiate from some of the other generations in the workforce, just this need to know the why. It's never been unavailable to them. They've never had to just kind of sit there with it without knowing, because you can look things up, and even if you don't find what you're looking for, you can post about something and in a forum or on social media, and people will share insights, or you can look at the comments. There's so many ways digitally to seek out that information. And so that is a really interesting characteristic I have found about Gen Z is they want to know the why really before starting or taking something on. And they're very used to having very personalized experiences because again, digital tools tend to be quite personalized. They tend to customize and tailor according to one's needs. They're used to, again, looking things up, but not just the way that other generations do, kind of the classic Google it. They actually turn to video content at a much higher rate. So they're looking things up on tools like TikTok or on YouTube, Instagram, Reels. And so that's another fascinating change. We'll get more into that, but this being a generation that has that digital native psychology, I think permeates in a very different way. And the last note I'll just make is pace, speed. Because the internet moves so fast, that's how Gen Z tends to work too. And so one of the common frustrations I hear from managers or org leaders is this shock that someone would start a new role and after a year or 2 years leave. And they're really baffled by this because the traditional mentality would be, it's your first job, you plug away at least 3 years, maybe 5, and then you hope that you're going to get that promotion and kind of start working your way up the corporate ladder. And that pace is just not realistic for Gen Z's constantly evaluating other opportunities. They have a wealth of opportunities available to them, and they're seeing if there's something better out there. And if there is, they're pretty comfortable to take that leap. So it's very critical that organizations share the why and share the roadmap for what is the value proposition for staying at an organization long term.
And in that, there'd be quite a lot of expectations around once they're in there, they expect everything to be transparent or accessible because they're so used to information being accessible, getting those answers, being able to find it and those sorts of things, which can be a bit of a change for organizations that have their information more segmented across silos or teams or layers in the organization.
Yeah, it's incredibly insightful what you just shared there. This core tenet of transparency. Again, they just don't know anything else. They've always been able to have that information, and so to your point, Bianca, like information at orgs is oftentimes siloed. It's oftentimes need to know. The thing I stress, however, is that if as an organization, whether it's internal or external, if you're choosing not to share the why, if you're choosing not to participate in the societal conversations, those conversations are still happening without you. And your employees are still sharing their opinions, sharing their questions, their thoughts. You're just not part of the conversation anymore. So it's kind of a classic PR thing where it's like, it's better to be in front of the message. It's better to be sharing your perspective than simply expecting a generation who is so used to sharing, so used to communicating online, expecting those conversations not to be taking place. I think we're kind of just fooling ourselves if we're thinking about that from an employee communications and engagement perspective.
And I think the other point I found really interesting in what you said is that they're searching all the time for different options, because our perception in the older generations is it's hard. It's hard to be constantly looking for other jobs or other options or other things, but that's just not the case for the generations who are native to technology, because they have dozens of tools on their phone feeding them information all the time. So it's not hard for them. It's actually really easy, and they're really curious, and they're searching and digesting information all the time by the sounds of it.
Yes, you're exactly right. And there's, I think, a couple important things to appreciate here. First of all, again, I warned everyone, digital native theme, it's going to be constant. This generation, they're so well connected that they can see what happens when people leave organizations. They can follow their peers. They can follow different people roughly their age. And during this great resignation period, around 2, 3 years ago, the economic data was incredibly clear. The Bank of America Institute they shared data from people's actual bank accounts, and it showed that people who were leaving jobs during this period were actually, on average, getting a 17% raise
Wow.
from their previous role. Yeah. And even though that's calmed down a bit, it still tends to hover around the 10% mark. And so you think about that, and then you think about people who stay at orgs and have to constantly pitch themselves and make their case for something as simple as like a cost of living raise.
Yes.
Why go through that hassle? Why have to pitch yourself when someone else out there might be willing to pay you another 10 or 20% and give you a promotion? So again, from a purely economic perspective, the case is pretty clear that if we're switching jobs every 2, 3 years, we will see our salary increase. We will see promotions quicker. And then the other thing you talked about, having options. There's some pretty critical global elements taking place. You already have a generation that has access to the internet, and then you have this phenomena of global remote work, right? You and I can converse on other sides of the world in real time. And why can't we work together in real time? Well, the answer is we can. And so I can apply for jobs in New Zealand and in Australia and Asia, in Europe, in the US. It doesn't really matter a ton. And then in addition to all of that, you have the global gig economy. So things like I can land for my conference in Australia and immediately pull up Uber and get an Uber to my hotel, get an Uber to the conference. Those are things that tend to have pretty low barriers to sign up, and we can be taking on our so-called side hustles as a Gen Z or anyone, and sign up on a Wednesday and be doing that by Thursday or Friday. So there are just so many options, which is why we saw when people weren't quote unquote feeling it, weren't vibing with it, they felt pretty comfortable taking on something else because they just know there's so many opportunities available.
And is it also driven by, because they've got so much access to information, data, and whether it's in the sources like TikTok and YouTube, but is there a high curiosity drive of actually, if I do move, not only is there a financial benefit, but I'm going to have new learnings and new social contacts as well. So actually it's a more interesting option for me.
I mean, you're just feeding me some such juicy answers here. So yeah, absolutely. Again, it's like culture and values. So I'll key it on values and I'll key it on learning and development. Gen Z has the highest alignment of values of any generation in the workforce. Whether or not that's kind of the idealism that tends to be associated with young professionals, or if it's going to be long term, we'll see. But Gen Z is very passionate about some causes like long term environmental sustainability, diversity, equity, inclusion. I know in the US, this is the most diverse generation to date. Things like workers' rights. And so, yeah, those are elements that they are focused on. And if they don't see that their organization is reciprocating, that's one reason they might get frustrated. And then I'll just double down on values, not because I'm implying that a lot of organizations have core values or aren't trying to do things well. I think most generally are. But I do think companies oftentimes do a poor job of maintaining that communication year round. I think, as we look toward 2025, I think we a lot of times have these kickoff meetings at the beginning of the year. Those are kind of the rah-rah, where we talk about our mission and we talk about our values, and that's all front and center. But what happens when it's July or it's September, October? I feel like sometimes that gets kind of lost, or all of a sudden the pressures of the daily business cycle catch up. And that's where I think we lose that employee engagement. not only from a macro perspective, but again, Gen Z used to having personalized experiences. It's very critical that we're communicating how does your individual contribution play a role in this overall perspective? Because that's what people want, right? Of all generations, people want to be valued and they want to feel like they're doing something that makes a greater impact. And again, I think we just, especially generations that grew up in a little bit more of a command and control kind of top down style, they're not really used to pitching like what's in it for you. It's just like,
Yeah.
just do your job, which is fair to the extent that yes, do your job. But if you're seeing people say, well, I'll just find a different job that I'm more bought into, that's the risk you run if you aren't making values and the why front and center.
And it's such a cost to organizations, attrition, having to go and replace people, retrain, and then they're going to leave. It's a real cost to organizations not to be focused on this. And probably one of the things that occurs to me is that organizations haven't yet caught on to the fact that, we're expecting Gen Z, and we were talking before about the percentage that they're going to be in the workforce. So I think, was that something like they're going to be 30% of the workforce by 2025 or something like that?
Yeah, yep, exactly. I think it's, the numbers are a little bit inexact, but it's over 25%. So between 25 and 30%. And then if you pair that with millennials, who's already the largest
Right.
generational category overall. So if you pair those two, you're looking at basically 2/3 of the workforce being either Gen Z or millennial, which is ultimately both kind of have that digital native psychology to an extent.
And that being the case, it's so important that we sort of just expect that these generations participate in a culture that was created by a different generation. Like you say, more that, hey, you've got a job, you should be grateful, work hard, stay at it, you'll eventually climb the ladder. Like that whole paradigm is completely different to a workforce that is now is already the majority, really, I suppose, if you think about it, in the workforce. What is your advice to leaders? Because leaders obviously generally tend to be in a different generation, and they have these new generations coming through, both the millennials and the Zs, obviously. What's your advice to them about what they need to start thinking about or changing in terms of supporting these generations?
Yeah, it's a great question, and in my answer, I'll just give a little supplemental precursor to add additional context to what you just shared, which is that despite what we just shared, 2/3 of the workforce are digital natives now. At the same time, we do have people working longer than ever before, into their 70s, 80s, and 90s. And so we have this very unique first time in history situation where we have arguably 60 to 80 years of a range of when someone entered the workforce.
It's a
So,
big range. Yeah.
yeah, it shouldn't be shocking to any of us that the norms, the styles of working, the methods of working, the methods of communication. It shouldn't be shocking to anyone that there's some pretty significant differences in expectations here. And yeah, not to belabor this point too much, but silent generation baby boomers, when they entered the workforce, they were inheriting it from generations that were possibly affected by World Wars I and II.
Yeah.
Going back even further, we're talking like industrial revolution. We're talking like our whole modern society and economy. And so these norms have been extremely stretched. So I just find that interesting and something that we need to start thinking about.
And it does sort of make the point that one size does not fit all. I know it's an odd saying, but in particular now for leaders with those multi generations, to your point, it becomes ever more important not to try and go, well, I'll have one approach and I'll work across all my team.
Exactly. And so I'm guessing we can link to this in our show notes. So I did give that TEDx talk recently, as you mentioned, and it was called The Great Workplace Rewrite, how to look at the millennials and Gen Z's digital native and what some of the expectations are around that. So perfect prompt, almost exactly aligned with your question there. So a few things, and I won't belabor this first one too much because I think we've talked about it a lot, but the simple idea of getting away from this mentality of you're lucky to have a job here to very much you're lucky to have talented employees at your company. And what are you doing to embrace them and make sure that they are feeling like they have a long-term career path? So real quickly on that note, I mentioned earlier the importance of having a shared collaborative vision. I really want to stress that as an opportunity for organizations. Meet with your employees, meet with your team members, find out what are they looking to get out of their career. Because not everyone, especially Gen Z, wants to just climb that corporate ladder, especially not for 10, 20, 40 years.
Yeah.
And so they might want to pursue that, but they might want to be different lateral moves. They might have different interests in the organization. So if we can help try to find that alignment between what does the job need, what are the core requirements of the job, first of all, obviously, but are there also elements that we could start working into your mix of responsibilities that get you even more aligned to what you're interested in and to where you want to see your career go. And to me, there's such an opportunity with AI and with these new HR analytics tools that can really help start to do some of that internal matchmaking. And that leads me right into my second point, which is all about modularity. I do think the idea of what a role at a company is, especially over many years, I think that concept needs to evolve as well. Gen Z is known to be a highly entrepreneurial generation. I've seen stats as high as 70% of Gen Z have a so-called side hustle, where it's staggering, where they're making some extra money outside of their core job. And so, which of course, we have to acknowledge the irony of a generation being called lazy, who at that are being entrepreneurial and taking on side hustles at that rate. So because of that, I think this is a generation, if we can tap into that creativity and that entrepreneurial spirit internally, there's a lot of potential there. So I believe long-term, a big trend will be how do we make roles and careers more modular so that people can take on new assignments. They can collaborate with new departments. They can try to develop new skills. And ideally, they're doing this all within the umbrella and embrace of our organization, or at least as much as possible, as long as we can still find that alignment between organizational priorities and employee priorities. I just think at a face value, that's not something that companies tend to think a ton about. It's that a lot of times you just have these roles, you need them fulfilled, and if someone's not as interested anymore, okay, we'll find someone else who is. I think there's a lot of opportunity to get more flexible around that. And frankly, to find that there are skill sets on our existing team right now that could increase people wanting to stay longer, increase retention, while also allowing them to grow and learn and bring those talents to our organization in a way that we would have otherwise completely missed if we only pigeonholed them in that junior role that they started their career at.
I imagine too that there's lots of opportunities with them for tapping into their content creation skills and being able to, if they did do this more modular approach, it deepens the social connections that they have across the organization. They can be great information sharers and carriers because of the way that they naturally operate both natively and from a social perspective. So there's some real benefits for organizations to tap into that and go, well, how can we leverage them from a communications and change perspective as well, not just their job that they originally came in for.
Absolutely. And let's double down on that, Bianca, and say, like, we'll get two birds with one stone. This idea of mentorship, this can be a great way to help create those knowledge transfer opportunities. I like the phrase I like to use is co-mentorship, as in it's a two-way street. It's not just top down. Hey, junior employee, sit there quietly while I tell you about the 30 years of my career. As valuable as that might be, it's not the most compelling sales pitch, right, to a young professional, or frankly to most people, I think.
Yeah.
So really trying to be very intentional. Okay, I will share my experience with you. But I also want to hear from you because you represent a new generation with different skills and different experiences. What can I learn from you? And then to your point, maybe we learn an incredible amount about social media, the way that Gen Z thinks, the way they can consume, the way they create content. And again, those insights, given that the just client base in general, whether it's B2B or B2C, is increasingly going to be Gen Z and millennial,
As
those are
well.
insights. Yeah, those are insights we need to know. So yeah, underlying all of that is treating this new generation with respect and implying and suggesting and showing that you value their insights as well, versus what we have been hearing a ton of, which is these endless stream of articles about how they're lazy, entitled, they don't want to work, where it's just like that's not going to be productive. And I can't imagine if everyone embraces that spirit at your org, how that's going to help retention. It's certainly going to probably do the opposite.
Yeah. And so for organizations to really tap into it, because it does sound from everything you're saying that that is a myth, that it's a lazy generation. They're not interested. It sounds like they're actually hyper interested, but you have to tap into their interest. Otherwise, if you haven't, you've lost them. So either you'll lose them on the floor or they'll just leave the organization full stop.
And I don't want to overly belabor it, but they want to know the why, because
Yeah.
then they can have the buy-in, then they can see what's actually being trying to be accomplished. And they also are very, and this is, to me, this is one of my favorites. They are a work smarter generation. They are used to using the internet to do things faster, more efficiently than has been done before. And so that so often can get misconstrued as lazy. Oftentimes it's like, hey, if the classic example is you have two employees, you give them the same assignment, one person works the whole day, they get in at 8, they leave at 6 or whatever, they do the assignment. You got another employee who does that in 3 hours. Who's the better employee? And there's still this kind of classic performative evaluation where the person who's early leaves late, they're perceived as the harder worker versus the person who actually achieved that in half the time or less. But it's so ingrained culturally that it's difficult for us sometimes to look beyond the semi-performative nature, I would call, of especially in-office dynamics.
It's such a good call out. And a lot of, performance reviews, that traditional annual performance review process, it has a lot of activity metrics. And, in organizations I work with, we often talk about shifting to outcome, because if the outcome is achieved and they can find a better way of doing it, then don't worry about the activity, focus on the outcome. And so that can also create a clash where we have these very old school, well, you need to do 10 calls a day, but I've already just signed up 5 deals. And, and I've got leads on, others if I do this activity instead, and letting them be able to do that and bring that innovation through. Just maybe.
Just real quickly, Bianca, I want something subtle that I feel like from your comments, it's like by knowing the why, by sharing the why, I believe that helps facilitate entrepreneurship and creativity. Because yeah, maybe the classic top-down model is we know that if you make 50 calls a day, you'll get 4 meetings and you'll get 1 conversion from that, kind of a classic sales funnel mentality. But maybe if the goal is to get 1 conversion a day, maybe there's something different we could do. Maybe there's something on social media we could be experimenting with. But yeah, if everything's just so prescriptive and we don't allow some of that autonomy, some of that freedom, we could be alienating people from leveraging their creativity and entrepreneurial spirit.
Which would be the biggest shame in today's world, where that's one of the top skills that you really need in the workforce. Maybe just quickly to round out the conversation around leadership then, what's the types of conversations that you would recommend leaders are having with their Gen Zs in particular around supporting them, getting the best out of them, tapping into those entrepreneurial skills, what would be your top tips in that space?
Yeah. Um, I feel fortunate that we've been able to touch on a lot of them, so that's been amazing. Thank you for facilitating such a useful conversation. I think for starters, just signaling that respect, signaling that you do care. So about their opinions. Gen Z, being digital natives, used to having a seat at the table, used to being part of the conversation. That is fundamentally the architecture of social media, right? Our first prompt when we log in is share, 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 share.
Yeah.
And so one idea I really like is the idea of having a young professionals board at your organization, so that we are making sure that Gen Z and whomever else that we decide that we want to categorize as young professionals, they can come up with some recommendations. And again, these tend to be people who are filling out some of the entry level-ish roles at our companies, which oftentimes are at the end of the day doing a lot of the core work, right? Because after that, you start to get layers of management. And so making sure that they have a seat at the table and that capacity, that we have a young professionals board as an example. So I really like that. I also, in terms of, I use this phrase called influencer leadership. Gets back to this idea of the why. Like, I think leaders, they have a wealth of experience. They're very talented at what they do. How can you get some of that trust and buy-in? Gen Z has a lot of natural cynicism about corporate world generally. And it makes sense because the oldest Gen Z who are in our companies now, they grew up during the Great Recession of 2008. They were teenagers. They saw parents and family, friends, siblings get fired and get laid off and have things just totally fall apart for them in the span of, after 10, 20, 30 years of career, all that just disappearing. And they went through the pandemic again in 2020 and saw mass layoffs again and mass disruptions to our economy and our society. And I know in the US, tech continues to struggle and there continues to be mass layoffs. All that to say, it's important to appreciate that there's some fundamental reasons there's a cynicism among Gen Z. And when I think about influencer leadership, I think about how can we capture that trust that seems to happen when we create video style content. We kind of create casual content, not the like tie behind a big mahogany desk, corporate video, more like I get my cell phone in my hand and I'm kind of walking and sharing just 30 seconds of something that current events or an industry trend or something that we're trying to pursue as an organization. So yeah, trying to make yourself more accessible, which is more important than ever before in an era where we have remote workers and we have hybrid workers and we don't have that face-to-face in-person connection the way that we might have in a traditional office setting. And then ultimately a few other things we talked about, looking at modularity and if there's ways to allow and train our managers to look for okay, this person seems like they're really interested in something here. How can we leverage them more throughout the organization? Learning and development, and then finally transparency, both of which we talked about, but both things Gen Z values extremely highly.
Fantastic. It sounds like, the good news for organizations is that there's lots of untapped potential still in their organizations and will continue to increase as those numbers increase. So it's a good opportunity to start thinking about those things from a culture perspective or a learning perspective or a leadership perspective. And I love that idea of modularity because it becomes so much more dynamic in terms of what you can do with your workforce. If you can, bring that to life, it's a much more viable strategic play than old school traditional structures, which can be very rigid and inflexible in today's world of change. Where can people find more about you? And we're going to share the link to your TEDx, obviously, in the description, but where can people find you and find out more about you?
Absolutely. So again, my name is Luke Goetting. My website is lukegoetting.com. We could share that in the links. The last name, Goetting. I am a global keynote speaker. So if this is something that your industry or your organization is interested in, please let me know. I'm based in the US. I've spoken in Australia, Canada, Poland, actually earlier this year, which was an incredible experience. And I also do workshops as well for organizations. And then I'm very active. You can follow all my travels on LinkedIn as well, same name as before. So please do follow me on all the social channels, and you can find those through my website. But yeah, I really enjoy these conversations, and I'll end, Bianca, if I may, on a little bit of a sales pitch, because I appreciate that sometimes my comments come off not selling my services, but just a sales pitch as to why this is important. Sometimes I get a little resistance in that it feels like the other generations are just having to cater only to Gen Z or Gen Z and millennials. And I really want to stress that's not what I'm trying to say. First of all, the why is so important. Share that why as to why things are done a certain way. That's the information that Gen Z really craves. But also, ultimately, we all have to evolve. We all have to continue to evolve. The economy, the society, it's nothing stagnant, right? Things constantly are moving. So if we just get too rigid in our systems and processes that we use that worked really well for us 5, 10, 20 years ago, that's not going to cut it either. And I think this new generation is very willing to explore those. Sometimes feels a little aggressive, but they're very willing to explore different ways of working. But ultimately, I just want to end with, this is legacy building. In the U.S., baby boomers are retiring at a rate of something like 10,000 a day. It's pretty staggering. And so if we are not building those relationships with the younger generation at our workforces, that is potential knowledge, like amazing institutional knowledge that is simply being lost. And so it is more critical than ever that we're facilitating these intergenerational connections, helping to make sure that we are building those next generation of leaders, because the stakes are pretty high if all that knowledge goes away and we do not have our next gen of leaders ready to go. What does that mean for the future of our companies? Future of our world, dare I say. We'll bring it as high as possible here.
Such a great call. And like you said before, we're talking about people inside our organizations, but they're also the consumers outside our organizations. So it is a change that is there already. And so being able to really bring that in and work with them more closely, because we should care about every generation that's in our workforce and be respectful of all the generations. So I really like that wrap up, Luke, and how important it is to embrace, dare I say, leverage from a pure business strategic perspective, because the world is changing and so is our workforce. And so being able to look at some of those things that you talked about and bring that in and front foot that is going to give us a competitive advantage as well in the market, obviously.
Exactly. Yeah. Why can't we all just get along, right?
And what a more vibrant and fun and innovative organization we'll have as a result.
Exactly.
Thank you so much, Luke. I'm looking forward to more people following you and finding out what they can do to help bring this more to life in their organizations.
Perfect. Really appreciate the conversation and opportunity, Bianca.
You're welcome.